In our last couple lectures, we talked about blood in general, and we talked a little bit about the components that make up blood. And as we said, blood is a connective tissue because it has cells and a matrix. Now, the cells are going to be your red blood cells or erythrocytes, your white blood cells are leukocytes, and your platelets are thrombocytes. And then your matrix is going to be that liquid component we call plasma. In the last video, we spent some time talking about erythrocytes, which are your red blood cells. And they really only have one job, and there's only one type of red blood cell. It's an erythrocyte, and its job is to transport gases. It carries oxygen and carbon dioxide, and it's really built to do that, and it does it really well because that's its only job. Leukocytes is the next topic we're going to talk about, which are your white blood cells. Now, these are a lot more specialized. Your white blood cells really make up what we talk about when we say our immune system. Really important part of our anatomy because we are covered head to toe in all different types of bacteria and viruses that are constantly just trying to look for a way in, and our white blood cells and our components of our immune system are there to protect us. And if there's ever a time where you have some appreciation for that, that's right now when we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Everyone's staying in because we are being attacked by a virus. And the reason why it's so dangerous is because it's a novel virus, which means that we've never been exposed to it before, which is why our immune system can't keep up. What we're going to talk about today a little bit is some of the components of our immune system and how it's able to fight off infection. So when you think of your white blood cells, they're called leukocytes. There's actually two major types. They break them into two categories. They're called granulocytes and agranulocytes. A before anything means not. We've used that before in class. So a granulocyte have grains, and when you look at them, you can see here, these are the images of them. You can see these are your granulocytes here. Now, I know this is just a drawing, but you can see that these three have little dots, and those are granules. And then these two here do not. Those are agranulocytes. The little erythrocyte here is just there as a reference of size. So as you can see, leukocytes or white blood cells are actually larger than your red blood cells. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about these individual cells, but one thing I want to point out is these granulocytes, they have these little grains, and what they are essentially, that is the component of the cell which makes up the either enzyme or chemical which that cell uses to do its job. In the case of this, we're talking about immune system. Okay, so there's really, like we said before, there's several different types of leukocytes, and we break them into two categories. And I'm trying to move this so you can see a little better. You can see that there are two that are agranular and three that are granular. So the three that are granulocytes are going to be called neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And then the agranulocytes are going to be lymphocytes and monocytes. Now, you've probably heard of lymphocytes before. That's, if you've ever heard of lymph fluid. We talked about the lymphatic system in class a little bit. The lymphocytes are specialized. But if you take a look here, we want to look at the numbers. And again, you are not going to need to know, just like in other areas of this class, I'm not going to hold you responsible for knowing the numbers of these. But what I do want you to note is which has the most. So as you can see here, neutrophils, about 40 to 75% of your white blood cells are going to be neutrophils. Eosinophils are only about 5%. Basophils are only about 0.5%. So they're very rare. You don't have very many of them. And then for the agranulocytes, about 20 to 50% are going to be lymphocytes, and then monocytes are going to be between 1 and 5%. Now, that's a big range, right? 40 to 75%, 20 to 50%. The reason why there's such a big range is it depends on the situation. If you're sick right now, your white blood cell count is going to be much higher for different cells, depending on what the scenario is. So for example, we're going to talk more about this, but if you have a parasite, you're going to have more eosinophils. If you stepped on a tack that has some kind of a bacteria on it and it cuts your skin and infects your skin, your neutrophils are going to be up. So depending on the scenario, you're going to have more of these different types of white blood cells. But we're going to go and we're going to take each one and talk about them a little bit. So the first one we're going to talk about is a neutrophil. And neutrophils are really the most abundant by a lot. And that is because they are like the little army men. And what I mean by that is they're like the infantry. They'll go attack anything. They don't care what it is. So these are identifiable because they have what is called a multi-lobed nucleus. So if you look down here, you can see that is a neutrophil on a microscope. And if we were in class, we would be doing a lab where you guys are going to be would be identifying these under the microscope, but hey, we're not in class, right? But you can see these are the red blood cells, so you can see for size, and then the white blood cells or the neutrophils are here. And multi-lobe means it has multiple lobes to it. So if you take a look here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lobes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lobes, and you can't really see the granules on these. The numbers, again, I'm not worried about the numbers for this class, but 3 to 7,000 per millimeter of mercury. Now, why is that? If you remember back to the red blood cells, it was 4 to 6 million per millimeter of mercury. So obviously a lot more red blood cells than white blood cells. And the job of these guys is they just cruise around your blood. And when there's an infection, what ends up happening is a chemical signal comes from the area that's damaged, and that attracts these neutrophils. So these neutrophils swarm the site of the infection, and they just eat everything that's there. That's called phagocytosis, and they engulf bacteria and viruses. This little clip here shows, I like this little clip. You can see that is a neutrophil there, and you can see the multi-lobe nucleus there, and that's a little virus, and you can see it's attacking it. So they just kind of blob around, and they go after anything that doesn't belong. Viruses, bacteria. Here he goes and gets another one. Now, a couple things about the neutrophils. They are not built to last. They die very quickly. They only live usually a couple hours, maybe a day or two. And when they eat what they eat, they die very quickly. They're not built to survive for a long time, and they actually build up and they die. And this is a little gross, but if you've ever seen pus before, that white pus fluid that comes out of an infection, that's dead neutrophils. So what you're seeing there are the dead bodies, essentially, of the battle of the neutrophils attacking whatever it is that gets into the system. So neutrophils are, like I said, they're like the infantry. They go in first. They're not specialized. They just go after everything. And they're really good at their job, but they don't last very long. Eosinophils are a little more obvious to see. For one thing, they have bilobed, so they have just the 2 lobes to their nucleus, and they have large red granules. And again, the granules have to do with what they produce. These guys, a lot less, 100 to 400 per millimeter. So 2 to 7,000 for the neutrophils, a lot less of these eosinophils. And these guys are really built for parasitic infections. We are lucky in the part of the world that we live in. We don't deal with too many parasites. We have a really good system for dealing with waste. Our water supply is very healthy. If you go to different parts of the world, they are being attacked constantly by amoeba, by different paramecium, little one-celled organisms that get in from the water. There are lots of different insects, worms that get into systems. And this is like, if you've ever seen like a tapeworm before, you look up pictures if you want to get freaked out. But these are organisms that live inside of us. And thankfully, like I said, where we live in the world, we don't think about that too much. But in certain parts of the world, they're dealing with that all the time. And eosinophils are the cells that really are going to go after parasites. So for example, if I went to the doctor and I wasn't feeling well and they took my blood count, and they saw my eosinophil count was very high, that would be a good indication that I have a parasitic infection. And they do the same thing that neutrophils do. They phagocytize, so they engulf the organism. They actually attack it. And these are also going to be connected to allergic responses. So eosinophils, and then the next one I'm going to talk about, basophils. We still are trying to figure out exactly how they work and what they do, but they are both going to be also involved in allergies. But eosinophils, really, when you think about them, you should think parasites. They attack parasites. And again, they don't live very long. They just live hours to days. Basophils are, again, they have lobe nuclei. They have very large granules. You can see that granules are here. They're very dark. You can see the red blood cells around it, again, for a reference on size. These are very low in number, only 20 to 50 per millimeter cubed of blood. So we're not talking about large numbers here. And these are really involved in allergic responses. So they are actually going to help the mast cells. If you remember back to the beginning of the year, we talked about tissues, and mast cells are the cells that produce heparin and histamine, which cause that allergic response. That's why when you take antihistamines, it blocks these. Basophils are actually connected to that. They help out, and they produce histamines as well. One of the things they found is basophils are actually going to be connected to anaphylactic shock. So if you've ever heard of anybody that has an EpiPen because their body goes into anaphylactic shock, for example, if someone's allergic to peanuts or something along those lines, that causes this really intense reaction in the body. These cells are involved in that. So they respond to allergens rapidly. And if there's too fast of a response, basically the system goes haywire. So when people have an allergic response to something like peanuts, where you're like, how is that even happen? It's the body reacting. It would be like if I got angry at someone for no reason. It's essentially your immune system's doing the same thing. It's attacking its own body, and it can be very deadly. It also produces heparin, which is the anticoagulant, and that is actually helps to keep blood flow moving. So when you get attacked, you want your blood flow. You want to be able to bring neutrophils to the area. You want to be able to bring these white blood cells to the area that's infected. So heparin helps that process. So basophils are responsible for an immune response that deals with allergies and also is connected to mast cells. And again, they don't live very long either. They only live for days to hours to days. Now we're going to talk about the agranulocytes, and these guys are a little more specialized. So the first one is a monocyte. Monocytes are big. These are the big boys. You can see here it's got a huge, it's huge compared to the red blood cells. It's got a big lobe nucleus, and these are not huge in numbers, but they are very effective at their job. Think of these as the cleanup crew. They come in and they get rid of all the dead neutrophils after an infection occurred. They attack bacteria as well. They attack viruses. They go after things as well. But their main job is they're like the cleanup crew. They come in after an infection has occurred, and they essentially get rid of all the dead cells. They get rid of any hanging around infection that's there, and they go through phagocytosis as well. These actually become macrophage. So if you remember back to that tissue unit, macrophage are the very large cells that move around your tissues. They become macrophage. So in the blood vessel, when it's in the blood vessel, it's called a monocyte. And when it slips out of the blood vessel into the tissue surrounding it to attack whatever's there, it's called a macrophage. And then finally, we have our lymphocytes. And lymphocytes are really they're like the special forces of your immune system. Neutrophils they don't know what they're doing. They just attack. Lymphocytes, on the other hand, these are much more evolved. And there's really two major types. So first of all, they're more common in children. You have them more when you're little, and then you get older, you make less of them. And there's a reason for that. You're probably more susceptible to infection when you're younger. As you get older, you have a better immune system in place. We have a good amount of them, 1,500 to 3,000 per millimeter cube. So it's similar in numbers to the neutrophils. And there's really two major types. There's T cells and there's B cells. T cells are the cells that actually attack and phagocytize. So they attack the antigens directly. So anything that gets into the body, they go after it. So for example, coronavirus, if you had that in your system, your T cells would attack it. Your B cells are what produce the antibodies for immunity. So for example, if you're exposed to the coronavirus, your B cells will actually identify it as being something that doesn't belong there and produce the antibodies that it needs to fend it off for further infection. It's why, for example, mono, if you've ever heard someone get mono before, I've said this before in class, you want to get it before you go to college because you're probably going to get it there. And once you've gotten mono, you don't get it again. And that's because your B cells produce antibodies and they stay in your system. And depending on the infection, it could be for your entire life. So as far as we know, for mononucleosis, you are immune to it for the rest of your life. As long as your B cells are there and they're producing the antibodies, you will be able to fight it off. That's the big question about coronavirus. How long are we immune for? And they're still trying to figure it out. So T cells actually attack the foreign body that's there. The B cells make the antibodies to help the T cells do their job. They live for a very long time, depending on the scenario. Some T cells, B cells, they last your entire life. We're going to talk a little more about immune system in another video, but that's just a very, very brief overview of how it works. And those are your white blood cells.